When people told Reddit their past, their stories, explained themselves with Reddit stories, foretold the future. Not really. But foretold the future with Reddit stories. The best place by the monitor was kept for the Reddit teller. Welcome back to your cozy spot by the screenlight. Today, I have some new tales to impart with some interesting outcomes. Revenge. But what is revenge, you might ask? Is it comparable to the Count of Monte Cristo? No, that's a sandwich. Idiot. Or perhaps Hamlet by William Shakespeare. Surely he would know revenge, right? Wrong. Revenge is a dish best served lukewarm with a side of vegetables and possibly a dash of salt on an oddly hot Reddit platter. Join me in tonight's episode of The Reddit Teller and find out. Tonight's dish is best served from Jock BBC Boy. I'm not going to explain what his name means, because I hate it. Titled Hippity Hoppity, You Damaged My Property. Bibbiti-Bobbiti, I'm calling the coppity. Bibbiti-Bobbiti-Boo, they're taking your kids too. This happened shortly after college. My mom is a retired, disabled woman who now owns her house on a quiet residential cul-de-sac. She's lived there longer than anyone else. Her neighborhood has designated parking spaces at the end of the cul-de-sac, all with the addresses of each house painted in the parking space. My mom doesn't get out much, so I use her designated parking space all the time. We lived in the same city, and I visited her weekly to bring groceries, fix broken things, cook for her, etc. My mom parked her car in the backyard of her house. Since she was not really going out and she went out so little, my mom kept busy by gardening or baking, buying cookies for the children on the street. Mom's neighbors, Ivy, never parked well. Whenever I stopped by, her car was always parked so close to my car that I had to park on the curb. I wouldn't have cared about Ivy's piss-poor parking, but for two things. One, she had 4 or 5 kids and had parties almost every weekend, leaving trash in Mom's yard. 2, I loved my car. A 2016 metallic ice blue Dodge Challenger Hellcat. The first car I have ever purchased brand new. I washed that car once a week, detailed the interior, and had rules against eating, drinking, or even leaving trash in my car. It was my pride and joy. Mom had called the police throughout Ivy's residence because of the parties. Ivy's guests would fill up the cul-de-sac with their cars, obstructing traffic, and get into loud, drunk fights at and after midnight. I often found empty beer bottles, empty condom wrappers, cigarette butts, and empty crack baggies on the fence between the properties, mostly on Ivy's side of the fence. Keep in mind, this is all important information. One Saturday, while having dinner at Mom's house, I heard a loud crash, and my alarm went off. I ran out to see Ivy's older model Honda Accord back out of her parking space and speed down the street. Ivy's Accord had a dent on the front bumper to the door, and the headlight had popped out. I approached my Challenger with trepidation and screamed in anguish at what I had saw. My car, my beautiful 3-week-old car with less than 500 miles on it, had a dent stretching from the passenger's door to the front bumper, and the right front wheel was tilted at about a 30-degree angle. Needless to say, I was livid and in anguish as I called the police, filed an online claim with my insurance, and arranged for a tow truck to take my damaged car to the dealership. The estimated cost of repairs came out to about $3,400. Total cost of repairs was eventually $6,500. I had a low insurance deductible of about $100, but my car was parked, and Ivy owed for the damages. For 2 weeks, I knocked on Ivy's door, or waited for her to come home. She stopped driving her damaged Accord and either rented or borrowed a Ford Fusion. When she was home, she didn't answer the door. When she wasn't, she stayed away until my rental car, a Dodge Charger, left my mom's parking space. I left a note on Ivy's door for her to call me, but only received harassing calls from restricted phone numbers or people blaring air horns in my ear when I answered. Cue the revenge. About 2 weeks after the accident, Ivy's children came to Mom's house for some cookies. I noticed that 2 of them had bruises around their eyes. If Ivy hadn't hit my car, I still would have done what I did, but maybe not as underhandedly. I had my mom take pictures with and of the children, but waited until the next party to strike. Ivy had a party that night, or the night after. Mom called me to let me know, and I installed an app onto my phone that gave me a fake number. I called 911 and reported the party. There's a loud party at 107 Mountain Drive, and I'm worried because the children are all around. These drunk adults, please, hurry. Mom called to let me know the police had arrived. I drove to her house, stopping by the grocery store first, so that appeared to be the reason, and saw Ivy and her boyfriend, Bane, already sitting in the back of a squad car. From a news broadcast that night, I found out that Bane had warrants out for his arrest. Initially, the charges were disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace. However, Mom turned over the photos of the children, anonymously mailing them through the post office with Ivy's address and name as the return address. Less than a week later, Ivy and Bane were charged with child abuse charges. I think Bane was charged with more severe charges as well for abusing Ivy's daughter. Either way, the children ended up in foster care, and Ivy and Bane ended up in prison. Yeah, take that, Shakespeare. Descending the spiral castle of Shakespeare's long, descriptive idea of revenge, we move to our next tale, titled, A Coworker Tried to Get Me Fired Over Breast Implants, so I pulled an Uno reverse card. Four years ago now, when I was 24, my mom died of breast cancer, and as both my grandmothers have also died of it, I saw a specialist for screening. I found out I had some cells in one of my breasts that could have turned cancerous at any given moment. I was told I have a few options. Option 1, I could have regular screenings every 3 to 4 months until it does develop into cancer. I was told the risk of the cells becoming cancerous was very high due to family history, but it could also potentially never turn, so it would just be getting those screenings for no reason. 2, I could get a single mastectomy on the breast with the bad cells, but they would need to keep an eye on the other one, so I'd still need regular checkups on the other breast. 3, I could get a bilateral mastectomy and remove all my breast tissue, basically eliminating the risk. Well, I chose and I went with the bilateral mastectomy. It was admittedly the most drastic option, but after seeing what cancer did to my mom and my grandmothers, I didn't want to risk it. I was warned about scarring, but told it should be fairly minor. It wasn't, and I was left with 2 huge pink jagged scars on either side of my chest, each about an inch long and about a ½ inch wide. And it caused me to go into a severe depression, where it got to the stage of me not even leaving my flat because I didn't want people to see me, throwing out my mirrors and getting physically sick looking at myself. I went to a therapist who suggested a plastic surgeon. The therapist said they'd never normally do that, but it was clearly something I was struggling with and I might not ever get over it. The therapist could see why I struggle with it. Although, I'll admit, the therapist did send me to ask about the scar reduction. The plastic surgeon suggested a cream, a laser, or implants. Well, the cream didn't work, and the laser was both expensive and risky. So, I went with the implants. My natural boobs were an F cup, so I went with a slightly smaller double D. Since then, my mental health has improved, and I feel a lot better about the way that I look. My confidence has gone up, as has my self-esteem. I know I shouldn't put so much into my appearance, but I wasn't exaggerating about these scars. Huge, bright, pink, jagged, raised scars. Just awful to look at, and I hated seeing myself. And they are now nicely hidden away, and you can barely feel them. In the present day, I'm 28. I'm working in an office, and I'm doing a lot better than I was. My coworker, Jill, found out I had had a boob job, but not about the cancer thing. When myself and my friend from years before the mastectomy were planning a holiday, and she made a joke about me going on a plane with my implants, and Jill overheard. By the end of the day, the entire office knew I had a boob job, but not why, and 6 people confirmed Jill had told them. Over the next months, Jill made many jokes and comments about my chest to coworkers when I was in earshot, at one point saying I had more plastic than Barbie and calling me fake in 2 ways. I didn't hear this one myself, but a friend in the office told me that Jill at one point referred to me as a sack of silicone. I don't know what her problem is, or was exactly, but at one point she mentioned the NHS, so I assumed Jill thought that I had gotten my boobs done for free on taxpayer money. I'd gotten the mastectomy on NHS, but gone private for therapy and implants. I asked her to stop more than once, but unfortunately, the places I'd talked to her were places like the lift and the woman's bathroom, where there weren't any cameras. And Jill just kept making comments no matter how often I asked her not to. I would say it every single day, but I heard at least 3 comments per week for 3 months. I hit my breaking point when me, Jill, and a few other coworkers were having lunch. I referred to something as being shallow, and Jill said, You would know all about being shallow, while gesturing to my chest. I snapped. I said, "Do you know why I have these? A few years ago, the doctors found potentially cancerous cells in my breast tissue. I was advised to get a mastectomy and was left with a huge, ugly, horrid scars on my chest. I went to see a therapist who sent me to a cosmetic surgeon who advised me to get implants to hide the scars. And I did just so I could look at myself in the mirror without crying. So maybe next time you want to judge someone for having cosmetic surgery, you should ask them why they had it first." And feeling like that was a mic drop moment, I picked up my food and left. For the rest of the day, I had about 1/3 of my office come up to me and offer support, and the rest telling me that Jill was just joking around and I was being a witch. I replied that Jill was the one being a witch long before I was. I then got an email from HR stating that they wanted to talk to me the following day, and when I called for clarification, they mentioned a hostile work environment. Note, this is apparently an American term that holds little weight in England, but it's what was said over the phone. I knew the person who signed off on the email and I'd spoken to. Her name was Debbie, and she was Jill's friend in HR, so I was fairly confident on who reported me. I realized that if this was already being sent to HR, I needed as much ammunition as possible, so I went about collecting my information. As Debbie had dealt with me so far, it was safe to assume she would be the person reviewing the complaint with me, and if that was true, I was ducked. However, I vaguely remembered a section on complaints that was in my contract when I first signed with the company. I flicked through the contract, and there was a part in complaints where it said I was contractually allowed to request a change of reviewer if I felt my allocated reviewer was biased. It was called an impartial overseer. I photocopied the page and highlighted that part. Then I messaged the people who had offered their support over Facebook and said basically, HR has asked to see me. Do any of you remember Jill insulting me to your face? And are you willing to write and sign something saying what you heard and when? Not everyone was willing to help, as Jill is somewhat feared in the office due to her befriending HR and management. But about 20 people were willing to help me. I guessed roughly when I'd asked Jill to stop previously, the 4 asks over the last 4 months. Some timings were easy to guess as they'd happened on my breaks or when I'd first arrived at work, and I wrote them all down, along with a rough time of when the lunchroom confrontation happened and a list of names of who was there for the lunchroom confrontation. I got to work slightly early the next morning. I went round and everyone who had messaged me, and most of them managed to give me a printed and signed letter. Some didn't manage to write one, but no big deal. This isn't exact words, as there's 16 letters to sum up, but here's a gist. My name is, insert name. I work with Jill, last name, and OP. On date and at time, approximately, I spoke with Jill, last name, during which she referred to OP as quoted insult. I felt this was inappropriate as it directly related to OP's appearance, and am willing to go on record further to establish that Jill, last name, has been discussing OP in the workplace in the same manner for 3 months now, causing me discomfort and creating what feels like a hostile work environment. Signed, their name. I wound up with 16 letters, all from different people, and one of them was in the lunchroom for my conversation with Jill. Some even bullet-pointed lists of everything Jill had said to them about me or other people. As it turns out, Jill has issues with a lot of people's appearances. She apparently makes comments about one coworker's weight and something anti-Semitic about another coworker's nose, all of which were put in these letters. There were about 45 people in the office, so while 16 wasn't a majority, it's still a decent amount. The letters weren't hugely long. Most were only a paragraph, but they had all the necessary information. I was asked to come to HR at 10 a.m. I took the letters from coworkers, the photocopy of the page in my contract, and the dates and times in a little folder with me. I got there, and Debbie was the one overseeing the interview. She got up from her desk, ready to lead me into another room. I immediately turned to the other HR coworker that was currently there and said, "So, is my meeting with you then?" Debbie said, "No, you're with me." I replied that this wouldn't sit well with me, as my contract states I have the right to an impartial overseer, and as I said this, I took out the contract page out of my folder. Debbie read it. I wouldn't let her take the paper when there was a shredder so close by, and said she could be impartial. I replied that I really didn't mean to be a pain, but I had it on good authority that the person on the other end of this complaint is her friend, and my contract does say I'm allowed to an impartial overseer. Debbie stomped off to get a supervisor. The supervisor asks how I know she can't be impartial, and I tell them that I have it on good authority about that Jill, who was on the other end of this complaint, is a close friend of Debbie. He asked Debbie if this was true, to which she openly replied, "I can be impartial." The supervisor took a deep breath, asked the other HR rep to come with him, and the four of us all went to review the complaint. I thanked them for being so accommodating. I was worried I annoyed them. Debbie took out the complaint, and all three of them went through it with me. Debbie looked homicidal the whole time the interview was happening, as she had clearly anticipated firing me, or at least recommending me to be fired. The interview went something like this. It took like half an hour, and they kept asking me the same questions, but phrased in different ways. So this is a really drastically condensed version.
You said outside that you think Jill, last name, reported you? Why is that?
Jill's had an issue with me for about 3 months now.
Why didn't you come to us when you realized Jill had an issue?
I had no issue with her.
What issue does Jill have with you?
4 years ago, a specialist identified potentially cancerous cells in my breast tissue. I had surgery to remove my breast tissue, thereby removing the cells and the risk. After the surgery, I was left with large scars on my chest. I went to a therapist for low self-esteem and depression. The therapist suggested a plastic surgeon who suggested breast implants to cover my scars. All of this is in my medical history, with which you have a copy of in my file, and my full permission to view. Jill found out about my breast implants but didn't know about the cancer. Jill had a problem with my breast implants and decided to communicate this problem to our coworkers.
Why do you feel this is true?
Here's 16 signed statements, all from different coworkers, all testifying that Jill told the entire office I'd had breast implants on the day she found out, and has since made comments about these breast implants frequently. They have quotes of what Jill said to them about it and rough dates and times.
Rough dates and times?
No one knew this would be escalated to such an extent, so no one really took notes as and when it happened.
What events do you think directly led to this complaint of harassment?
For me, the harassment began when Jill told everyone about my breast implants without my consent. But as to the complaint placed against me, it would probably be what happened about yesterday in the lunchroom. Jill made a comment about me being shallow while gesturing to my breasts, and I replied by giving her an abridged version of my relevant medical history and ending it with a comment about the importance of getting the full story. There are cameras in the lunchroom, so I'm sure you'll be able to find the conversation. I'll admit I could have handled the situation better, but after 3 months, I felt that I had to put my foot down. Here's a list of the names of people who were also present. There were 6 people at that table, including myself and Jill. One of these people is also in those letters and has written their account of the conversation and signed it.
Had you had a conversation with Jill prior to this regarding her comments about you?
Several. Spaced out over the last 3 months. Each time I communicated to her that I felt uncomfortable and upset by these comments she was making and would appreciate it if she were to stop.
To your knowledge, was Jill made aware of your former cancer at any point at this time?
No. It wasn't mentioned in the conversation with my friend she overheard, and I didn't tell her because, frankly, it's none of her business. And I didn't feel the need to detail my medical history to a coworker in order to avoid further sexual harassment. The supervisor stood up and said,
Well, I think we're done here.
He shakes my hand and sends me back to my desk, saying that I'd hear from them after they reviewed the evidence, the letters, the CCTV, medical history, and anything they had already, and made a decision on the case. I got back to my desk, pulled up my CV, and prepared to start the job search again. About an hour goes by, and the person who wrote the letter and was there for the lunchroom conversation gets called for a meeting with HR. They come back about 10-ish minutes later. The other people who were also there for the lunchroom conversation got called up one by one, except Jill. All of them are gone for about 10 minutes and then come back, find a coworker, and say that HR wants to see them. Then, the people who wrote the letters but weren't there yesterday are also called one by one, and each are gone for about 10-ish minutes, some longer, some shorter. By about 3:30, it looks like everyone who wrote a letter or was there in the lunchroom had been interviewed. Then, finally, Jill gets called in. She's gone for about 30 minutes and comes back fuming. She glares at me while I work, but I ignore her. 4:30-ish, Jill gets called into HR again. 5 p.m. rolls around. Everyone is either leaving or getting ready to leave. When Jill storms back into the office, she glares at me the whole time she packs up her desk. She then starts telling anyone who will listen that I got her fired before shoving her way onto the lift. An email comes in from HR. My case is closed. Thank you for joining me by the monitor. And to everyone listening and enjoying this content, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe to hear more of these stories stemming from tragic to comedic to downright horrific. And as always, see you in the next chapter.